I think the exercise, the process, it's like being a sportsman. You got to go and practice as well. And it unlocks things for me. And a lot of my series are not necessarily the first time I've tried them. So, it's not always that first time around. I think you got to sit with things, you mold them, you play with them. And you always got to be curious. And I still get a thrill out of creating. Like, it still gives me an adrenaline rush.
Kia ora te whānau. I've got Henry Hargreaves here, who's a Brooklyn-based artist and food photographer who grew up in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. He began working in fashion in the early 2000s, relocating to New York City and working as a fashion model before pivoting to be behind the lens. He shoots for clients such as Ralph Lauren, New York Magazine, GQ, National Geographic, Boucheron, the New York Times, and Sagmeister. Hargreaves' work have featured in exhibitions at the Maxi Museum in Rome, the Venice Biennale, the Lunchbox Gallery in Miami, and Precinct 35 in New Zealand. And we're stoked to have him here with the big idea. Henry, thanks so much for joining us. How are you, brother?
Great. Pleasure to be here. Excited to talk to you and share some tales.
Oh, I'm sure you've got a fair few, but let's start at the start, because every story has a start, middle, and end. How did your journey to where you are now begin? Did you always know you wanted to be in the creative industry?
I always had a creative inkling, and I kind of had a few roadblocks in New Zealand. Like, I loved my arts and crafts, and I loved doing art at school. I didn't get into Polytech. So I ended up going to Canterbury University and just doing a general BA degree. And my aunt worked at a all-girls school in Christchurch called Rangiruru, and I used to go on the weekends and like use the dark room there and kind of play around, but also, like, in New Zealand, especially in the 90s, I didn't know of anyone who made a career as a creative. There were, like, everyone who did it, like my aunt was an artist, and there was like Peter Robinson was about as big a painter as you could have at those times, and he was my art teacher at school. It was like anyone who was a creative was also a teacher, and I didn't know any photographers either, and I thought a photographer was the guy who took the school portraits, and and that was like about it. So it wasn't until I went traveling that everything kind of opened up to me.
Just talk to us about that, because often most creatives don't see it as a career. Like, when you went in that dark room and you were playing around, and I guess your love for photography was starting to blossom then. When was the moment where you started to think, you know what, I think I can make a career out of this? Did you have to leave the country and go overseas? How did that happen?
Yeah, it was when I started modeling. So after I finished university, I had that total anxiety of, I've got a BA now, but I have absolutely no idea what I want to do, where it's going to take me, what it can do. And so I did the great procrastination, which is the OE. And I got a one-way ticket to the UK, and with a stop in Thailand and Bangkok. And I think I might have saved about $2,000 US, which, wasn't too shabby 20 years ago. And I knew that would hold me out for a couple of months on the super cheap there. And I was in Bangkok, and there's a tourist strip called Koh San Road. And I was going down Koh San Road, and I got approached by a Thai guy who asked me if I was a model. And I was kind of like, I was shocked, because New Zealand also at that period, like, I had no success or get no attention from the ladies or anything in New Zealand growing up. It was very much that era of, like, All Blacks and Dan Carter and, guys who are like big built guys. And I was just imagine a younger version of me, scraggly, long hair, and I kind of thought he was taking the piss, and then I was also super suspicious. And anyway, kind of like slowly figured out that it was legit, and it happened. And it was when I went on those sets, and I was like, holy shit, this is like the guy taking the pictures or the girl taking the pictures is like, this is awesome. It's creative, but it's like actually is a source of income there, and it's fun, and they're kind of like, there was also, I'd done film studies at university and I loved the idea of film, but it was such a big undertaking and such a big compromise. And like, I like the way that on a photo shoot, it was like one day. It's like you come up with an idea, you bring the pieces together, you execute it, and you move on to the next thing. And I love that idea of having an idea, being able to make it happen, and then move on to the next project. And so that's when I was like, that's what I want to do.
I want to talk about the Thai guy because
Yeah.
as a young Kiwi just landed in overseas, and out of all places, you're in Thailand, and a Thai person approaches you. You know, that's a pivotal moment in your creative career, right? Like, do
Yeah.
you look back at that? Did you ever have any doubt in your mind? Did you think, nah, I'm not going to do this? Like, what made you say yes to that crazy opportunity in the context of where you were at your life at that time?
I mean, I made him, I mean, I was super suspicious. I made him meet me again. I think he had a magazine, or he had a couple of magazines to try and, and it was Thai GQ. And he was like, "This is me. I'm the stylist. This is my name." But I'm like, it could be anyone who's, this is. And he wanted me to come to his apartment to take pictures. And I was like, the script is, pretty, pretty well trodden and used. And so I was like, I'm not comfortable with that, and I'm not interested if that's the case. And he arranged with like a little photo store that was kind of close by. He was like, "How about we go here?" They did passport pictures and things, and there was a little area. And he was like, "Why don't I? Because I need pictures to better show the clients who you are." And he brought down some props. I mean, I still remember. I mean, it was he um, put kind of like wrapped up my hands and put like a band-aid over here and tried to make me look like a boxer. It was, it was pretty cringy. And took some photos of that and then got some like neon tubes and kind of did a couple of things. And anyway, did these pictures. He called up a couple of days later and was like, "Look, you've got the job." And I was like, it has to be cash, there was just like all those things, like what it is. And yeah, I tiptoed into it. And, like
So
he was a weird dude, but I was like, I'm just gonna like there's an opportunity, and let's see what I can make of this, being as responsible as I can.
yeah, and you speak about opportunity at that time of your life. That opportunity's led to you. You know, you modeled for a bit, and then you switched over to being a photographer. But talk to us about opportunities and how they've come for you. Are there some opportunities that you've had where you can say, "Yep, that was a moment for me. That was a turning point." Like this, meeting that Thai guy, one of them. Have you had other opportunities come up, and you've been like, "Oh, yeah, that's it. I'm doing it."
Well, I think knowing when to pivot is another big opportunity. So I got into so after this, long story short, I went to London. I did like 3 or 4 jobs in Thailand. Went to London, got a job in a pub, and thought the modeling was done. This Thai guy ended up coming to London for a shoot, and we met for a drink, and he gave me the pictures, and he said, "You should go to some agencies." And I got picked up by an agency and sent to Milan for Fashion Week. And I mean, I just thought it was a all expenses paid trip to continental Europe, and that was going to be that. And yeah, and I drew 4 aces. I got like all the big shows in Milan that season. I got booked to be the campaign model for Prada, and it was great. And I modeled full time for the next 3 years. I did 5 seasons, and it was awesome. But also, I you could see you could get like caught in the cycle of never getting out of it. You're doing something that's interesting enough, is glamorous enough, you're getting paid enough that there's no kind of like hunger to do anything else. And I kind of felt like, every 6 months you do the same show circuit and things. And, you know, it was fun, but you're also living out of a bag. I imagine it's a bit like being a professional sportsman a lot of the time, where you're like, there's really not much downtime. And I was like, if I am going to make like, I've got to kind of like, well, I've got momentum. I need to make a shift. And I got my US work visa through modeling. And yeah, and I was like, that's where I want to be. I love the energy in New York. I want to make a go of being a photographer, and that's where I want to set up shop. And I remember telling my agent that it was my last fashion week that I was doing in Milan. And he was like, it was like everyone was like, whatever, we'll see you next season, And then when I was like, no, I'm not kidding. I'm not coming back for these shows. I don't care who's got me on hold to do, to do this. I'm like, I'm done. I'm on the next thing.
Can you talk to us about that? Because I guess that's something that's overlooked by creatives, because from the outside looking in, you're thinking, mate, you've cracked it. You're working with some of the biggest fashion brands in the world. You're in demand. You're ticking over. You've got work coming in. But what was it for you that made you use that word pivot? But for some creatives out there, what was it for you that made you pivot? Was it not as exciting? Did you want a new challenge? Like, what was it about you that decided to say no to that, even though you're in demand, and then get into photography or go to America?
Yeah, I mean,
Some
like,
people would kill to have that, right?
yeah, no, I mean, look, I mean, we're talking about real champagne room problems. I, I just like felt like it hit the glass ceiling. And in the fashion industry is obsessed with youth and newness. And in the first seasons, you're going out. I was opening the shows. I was getting like three key outfits, and like a big part of it. And over time, you realize that hey, I'm now coming out. I've got like one token outfit in the middle of the show. I might not be here next season. Um, you've worked with all the big photographers. They also want to everyone wants a new face. I could feel that forecast. And also of the guys who really can have long, long careers, they end up, probably start looking a bit more like they get good chin, good strong jaws. They get some 5 o'clock shadow. Like, I'm 45 and I still look like
Yeah.
I get a cookie duster.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to be that classic, timeless guy, and I didn't really want to either. I was like, hey, it's great, but yeah, I want to do something else,
That's
and
so
so
cool, bro. That's awesome that I want to say recognize that, but you like, you know what? It's time for a change. And then but you wanted to stay in the creative field. So what was the next challenge for you in terms of your creative journey? Because did you feel like you had to reinvent yourself? Because you realize, I'm not going to keep modeling now. I still want to be in the creative industry. What next for Henry?
yeah. Well, so I used to get contracts in Japan, and I mean, this was also the era of film cameras. And they've got this whole photography district in Tokyo of just these buildings of all the cameras and things at the time. And I went around and I got myself a Mamiya, which was this medium format camera. And I started shooting the other models when I was in Tokyo. And you get these crazy locations and buildings, and it was surreal, and going and doing all of that. And then yeah, and then I was like, okay, but I need a studio. I need a space. I need somewhere where I can it's not weather dependent. And there was a model I met, and he had a place in Brooklyn, and I can't remember what he was doing, but he was like, look, it's free for a month if you want to sublet it. And I came subletted the spot, and I loved the positivity in New York. Like, I'd lived in London, that was kind of my base beforehand. I had an aunt and uncle who lived there. And in London, I always felt it was like so, just everyone held their connections very tightly and were very sort of, not open and forthcoming with introductions and taking chances on people. And when I came to New York, I was just like, man, I felt this freedom in this city where, not only was, subways run 24 hours and bars are open until 4, and you're never more than a $20 taxi ride away from where getting home at the end of the night, and all this stuff. And I spoke the language. I mean, that had also been another barrier. I was god awful at like languages, and so when I went to was based in these other countries, I always had that up against me. And yeah, I love this optimism in New York, and so I was like, that's where I want to be. This guy's he had this. It was the classic like Brooklyn old industrial building that had slowly turned into little artist live workspaces, like big lofts with like janky mezzanines, like nothing's built to code. And a space over the hallway came available, so I just said, I'm in. I'm taking that. Um, I built a mezzanine level on my one with 2 bedrooms and rented out the other bedroom. And I had my bedroom and I had a space to, a massive living area, which doubled as my first studio. And I took that, and then because I'd stopped bartending and I'd sent all my money back to New Zealand, I was like starting from scratch again. Because this was also, I remember at that time, one New Zealand dollar bought 45 cents US. And so I was like, I'm just pushing everything back to this great exchange rate back to New Zealand. And I was like, and I'm going to start fresh. So I needed to get a job. And I got a job bartending. Um, and that's what I'd always done when I was at high school. I catered at weddings in Christchurch, and then when I was old enough, I got a job working at the Lone Star in Christchurch, and was the bartender there for my university years. And so it was a traveling occupation. It was like a skill that I knew that I could have. I had, and so when I came to New York, I got a job working in a bar, and it was awesome. And so that was like bartending at night and then attempting to like try and set up shoots by day.
Is that a normal lifestyle for creative? Because I love how often when you start in the creative, you can't make it full time at the start, right? So you're hustling, you're doing the side job because you need to still
Yeah,
pay the bills, right? So I can just imagine
totally.
you bartending in the evenings or whenever you do that, and then also doing your creative outlet passion on the side and trying to balance the two and eventually hopefully do less of the bartending and more of your creative side. How did you manage that balance, trying to fulfill your creative passion and your studio and also having to work just to, keep paying the bills?
Yeah, I mean, so it's tough and it didn't go to plan for a while. By this point, I was 27. And, honestly, the bartending in New York life became my priority for a couple of years there, where I was like, because of, the tipping culture here, you're well looked after. Essentially your bar's the best party in town every night and you're in charge, and then you're getting invited out other places, and it's a great, it's a great fun time. And one of my first photo projects I did at the time, which was bartender portraits, and it was looking at this like this like handcuff that bartending can be, where it's like, hey, you're making enough money to not actually really have to face the thing you came to New York to do in the first time place. Um, and this is kind of a bigger thing. One thing I love about New York is it's not a city that a lot of people are born and die in. It is a really transient city, which I'd found very different to somewhere like London or in Paris. And, like, I mean, look, we know it in cities where we're from as well, where, people have been there their whole lives. And it's very rare to find those sort of people here. And there's this massive influx of people coming to do something. We want to come and try to make that dream come true. And that was what I was sort of exploring with this was, and all these bartenders, they come to be musicians, they come to be actors, they come to like do all these things. And I was like, did it help or hinder you by bartending? And in general, all of them had just ended up procrastinating to the point they kind of missed their opportunity or like lost their momentum.
Were you fearful when you were bartending? Because you're making a living, you're getting by just enough. I love how you say it keeps you there handcuffed so you don't go there to do what you wanted to do. Was there a moment there where you thought, this is me for the foreseeable future? Like, I don't know if I can get my creative passion as a job. Like, were you thinking I'm going to be bartending for the rest of my life?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and that comes back to another one of these pivot moments, where I was like, I can't give myself properly to a shoot when I'm working at night. It's like your body kind of, the rhythms, they get revved up for like one cycle and not the other. It's kind of like having jet lag. Um, and I was like, I either need to get rid of this dream of doing photography and embrace a life in restaurants and bars, or like, yeah, I've either got to kill that dream or actually make it happen. So what I did, I worked my last shift when I was 30, when I turned 30. And that was my moment. And I had enough money saved up that I could live my current lifestyle in this sort of loft for 6 months. And I was like, at the end of these 6 months, I am either going to sell my camera gear and just work in restaurants, or I will have made a career and never have to make this other decision. And yeah, and so that's what I did. I kind of focused on that 6 month period and was like, I've got to hustle, I've got to get out of my comfort zone. Um, I've got to write lists. Like every day, it's like I've got to write lists and I've got to be obsessed about crossing them off, or else I'm just going to end up like freaking catching up on Netflix. You know. Um,
Man, let's wind the clock back, man, because that is such a pivotal moment in a creative's life because it's like that fork in the road, right? You come to it and I love that you got to go balls deep with it
mhm.
or you let it go.
Yeah.
When you made that decision to go balls deep, how would you describe that 6 months where you kind of had that deadline where you're like, man, I need to make this work? What was your mindset going into that? You wrote lists, you were ticking them off, you were hustling, were you getting up? Like what take us back to that moment, bro, that 6 month period. What were you doing? Some tips and tricks that fueled the fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think I felt liberated by doing this. I was like, I'm taking this like what if out of the equation, and I'm going to find out like if or no. And I, yeah, it was really about, oh God, it was the business card days. I had my little like files of business cards and would go through. And okay, now here's a tip that I did in my modeling days, and I think for any like, and I did it all through this time. I used to keep a little book, and I used to write down everyone I met's name and a little something about them, like a little anecdote. And when you reconnect with someone and you remember something about them, they are immediately like drawn to you. There's a connection. There's something extra. Um, and that was something that I had done and I kept doing it. And so I had like a little bit of like a bit of a Rolodex. And also the other thing is the bar had been a great place to meet people. And I suddenly knew a lot of people around New York and connections. And also the other thing that happened here, I started trying to shoot fashion. And when I worked in the restaurant, the first paid jobs I was getting was actually food photography jobs. Like, hey, can you come and shoot, the menu, and can you, do this and that. And I was actually like, you know what? I like this better. I like it when it's me and I'm just problem solving with light and composition, and I'm not trying to describe hairstyles to a hairdresser when I really don't have any idea, or like, makeup finishes, or all I really knew was like red lip and smoky eyes. It was, I had none of that. And I was like, I don't think that's my calling. Also, the other great thing about food was I was like, I can go to a supermarket and get everything I need for like $20. Like I can get like ingredients and actually make something to shoot. And the fashion shoots were such a pain in the ass, especially when you're not paying people. Like there's always someone who doesn't show up the day of, and you're always like, doing that. And it's glamorous, so everyone tries to do that. There weren't many people in food and still life, so I was like, that's what I want to like start focusing on. So I think that's another thing, is figuring out a focus. um
And how do you manage to do that as a creative? Because you often find with creatives, they're bouncing around, They're trying one thing, trying another. Is that something you recommend? Like for you, you've managed to pivot so well with your journey. You plot yourself with where you've been and where you are now. What advice would you give to people who are still, they want to be in the creative space, but they don't know particularly right now exactly what they want to do? What's
yeah,
something that you would recommend that they do to help them find that place?
I mean, look, I think you try it all. You find what is your calling, like I mean, I think the most important thing is what you actually enjoy doing, because that's the thing that won't be a chore to you. You don't try and do what you think you should be doing. And I like started to like really like I need like an elevator pitch of what it is that I do. And it became like, I'm the guy that tells interesting and quirky stories with food. And it's like, yeah, of course. I mean, like, I shoot all sorts of other things, but like on my website, I'm like, I'm going to keep it focused. If people see you can do one thing really, really well, I think then they're often like, oh, and he probably can do this other stuff. But if you, and I see it a lot with a lot of my photographer contemporaries, and they're like, I'm trying to show all these things on my website. And I'm like, you kind of get lost. It's like I don't really know what your voice is, your perspective. You're like the guy who does a little bit of everything, but you're not specific.
I love how you've put that, because getting lost, like, I visited, seen your work, and I'm like, okay, I've never met Henry, but I know what you're about, and I love it.
Hmm.
I'm like,
Hmm.
that is what you're known for. Is that a tip you'd just recommend that creators is once you find it, just really hone in on that specific niche and just master it, and everything else will flow from it, and other bits of creativeness?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's going to be a hundred other like other parts to it, but I think in general, and especially when you're trying to make it as a commercial in a commercial field, um, it's a kind of shortcut to thinking for people. People, they like to be able to be like this. I think it's like help someone. Just imagine if someone's like describe, if they describe, Jean-Michel Basquiat, you're like, oh yeah, the street artist who does the crowns, and like, you're like, Banksy, it's like, oh, you're always, they're like, hey, they do a ton more, but it's like, they start to find something, and I think I don't think there's no um shame, I think, in like trying to put yourself like to do that. To me, that's part of marketing, I guess.
Yeah, that voice, because there's so many artists out there. Do you find that sometimes it's quite easy to get lost? And it's, how do you make yourself stand out? Is it about honing in on that one thing, and that's the first thing people see, and then they can see that you do all these other things? Is that how you've managed to stand out? Because your work is quite, it stands out, and that Henry did that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, I mean, it's a conscious decision, and like that's what I put out there as stuff in that genre. Like when I post on like my socials and things, I'm also like, I want to keep talking to that audience. I don't want to muddy the waters. Like I love it when I get to do other things. But I love creating it. I also love. I mean, this is also something that's it's a little bit of a segue, but I love the process, or I should say, I love the service of commercial work. Like a lot of creatives are like, commercial and art is like, oil and water. And and I think that's like coming back to my bartending stuff. I love this. I love making someone's night for them special. I loved like entertaining them. I love doing that. And I love at my studio, like I've got a 4-day commercial shoot. I'm 3 days in at the moment. And I love like curating, everyone comes. It's like, I've got the music figured out. I'm like, we're getting, breakfast, lunch, dinner these days from these special places in Brooklyn. I want everyone to come and have an experience. And, these pictures I'm shooting, I'm probably not going to share them on any of my stuff because they don't fall in the kind of silos that I choose to identify myself with. But I get a great lot of satisfaction out of shooting it, nevertheless. And I think it keeps me fresh. Like I do these things like this, and like last night, I'm like, oh fuck, let's go back to my spreadsheet of personal projects that I want to get onto and start, doing, doing that. Like, yeah,
Can you
I'm
tell us
hungry
how
for
important it
that.
is to stay fresh? I love how you say stay fresh, and the word personal projects, right? Because
Hmm.
as creatives, sometimes you get into the commercial scene and you just feel like you're doing someone else's work, right? You're good at what you do. But how important is it, A, to stay fresh, and B, how do you stay fresh to make sure you're still enjoying what you're doing, the actual creativity of
Yeah.
photography?
Um, I mean, look, I think that my value is in, I always like to also make sure that like putting out that my value is in my next thing, not the last thing. And that's why also when you go to my website, it is not commercial things front and center. I'm like, I've got a page of that, but I'm like, hey, I want you to see like what goes on in my head. And that's kind of like where I start, and that's who you're hiring. You're not hiring someone who is just an executor. And as a photographer, it can be really hard to see what a photographer brought to the game. It's like, hey, you can have amazing creative coming from an agency, an amazing art director, you can have an amazing retoucher, and it's like literally all you did was do some lighting that anyone could have done and taken the photo. And was that you, or did you bring something else to it? So I like think that showing where your mind's at is really important. I also think uh, you know, we've all worked with people who are like out of love with what they do, and you know it. And I think the moment that happens to me, that's when the next pivot's going to be. Um, and yeah, so, and look, and in certain ways, like I'm actually going through another like like low pivot at the moment, where I'm also like embracing like this AI world at the moment.
That's something I want to talk to you about, bro, because as a photographer and when AI first came out, there was like, oh no, they're going to take over our jobs. But I've seen the way you're pivoting and you're trying to incorporate that.
Hmm.
What advice would you give to creatives out there who are battling that AI technology? What are you doing at and around that this time? You're embracing it. You're working with it. What are some things that you think creatives should be doing with AI? Is it a us and them thing, or should we be more collaborative?
I mean, look, I think it's just a whole new toolbox has come out, and it's not going back in the closet. It's out, and like and this is this is something where, I mean, like a lot of people, I kind of sat and had some opinions and things like that, and then I was like, fuck it, let's actually take some time to see what this is about, rather than sitting there like pointing my finger and sort of joining the echo chamber. And I was like, holy shit, this is like unlocking new ways of looking at things and like working with problems. And for me, it was like, oh my god, I can create a time and a place and an environment that I can't access. I don't want this just to be shortcuts, or like doing things cheaper than they were, that I don't need these other people. I'm like, let's use this to really do some fun stuff. And I yeah, so I got started getting really into it, and was like, how can I like really sharpen my tools on this and get better? And it's so new right now. I mean, this is another thing. The level of entry is never going to be this low again. Most of these programs are probably an hour to actually get like pretty proficient with them. And I went to the biggest YouTube channel called Curious Refuge on AI filmmaking, and took an online course with them, because they were the only ones who were doing anything like I, I looked at a few things, and I was like, most of them I thought was just smoke and mirrors. And I did an AI filmmaking course with them, and I thought it was awesome, super inspiring, and has just like unlocked a whole new, workflow to me. And honestly, like I hear a lot of the criticisms and complaints, and I mean, I've got space for it. I guess, I think, by the way, this is probably another one of my lessons, is I think the one of the other things that's been really helpful to me is I never get bogged down in negativity. Um, probably probably to a point that's some people it's like a little delusional. Like I know my wife sometimes is like, why the optimism the whole time, and why this? And I'm just like, I don't need to be stuck worrying about what someone else is doing. Like I don't, I I have impulses to to look at other people's work and be like, God, I wish I did that, or like criticize it or anything. And I have those impulses, but I've kind of started to train myself to just be able to look past it and just be like, hey, everyone's on their own journey, and not always compare myself to others and where they're at. And uh, yeah, and so this a little bit of that with the AI stuff. And I think one of the biggest things is, yeah, the image bots have been trained by looking at all sorts of images, but it's exactly the same way that we would get a creative brief and it was like, here is the lighting reference, here is the composition reference, here is this. Now just combine those and take a picture. And I'm like, the only thing this does is it's just better at it than we were. It takes out a lot of the human error. And it was also when film came in. I remember all the pushback. And I think the other thing that happens a lot in creative industries is it's been it's locked, the barrier of entry has locked out people. And when we shot film, it was a pain in the ass to shoot. It was expensive. You had to know what you were doing, and it meant that there was a barrier to entry that kept it exclusive. And and digital took a lot of that away, and this is taking it away again. The tree's been shaken. We're reshuffling, and yeah, and I'm excited. I'm excited for some change. I'm excited to see things go in a different way, and yeah, just kind of back myself to move with it. And if it doesn't work, hey, there's bartending always.
Pivot.
Yeah,
Eh?
yeah.
What's when you look back at your career so far and where it's going now? Is there one bit of advice that sticks with you every day where you're like, yeah, that's gold? Like if you're speaking to a young creative on the start of their journey who might be boarding that plane to Thailand from Ototahi and thinking about where their creative career is going to go, but best piece of advice you've ever had that you've hung on to?
I mean, I mean, I'll probably keep coming back and telling you more and more bits and be like, oh, that's better, that's better. I mean, I really think a lot of it is just you got to keep being curious and produce, keep making work, and don't be worried about like how good it is. I mean, God, last night, like, I was saying I'm on the middle of the shoot and I was hungry to do something. And I came across this article of hangover cures from around the world. And so I was just like, and I mean, this is the perfect example of AI where I'm like, you know what? I can put a series together in a couple of hours on the couch at home, at night. And so I'm like, okay, let's go to Mongolia, and they have this like tomato juice with a sheep's eye. I'm like, let's make that, and let's get some hangover Mongolians and some partying. Now let's go to there was one at New York City with its hangover cure. Let's go to Denmark where the beer is, they call it something like they got some fun name for what they call the beer. Anyway, I put together 4 or 5 of these things and the Philippines and yeah, and I'm like, oh, this is fucking cool. And I show my wife, and she's like, you know, and and I'm like, you know what? Great. Maybe it's not for her. Maybe it isn't going to be a great hit, but I think the exercise, the process, it's like being a sportsman. You got to go and practice as well. And it unlocks things for me. And a lot of my series are not necessarily the first time I've tried them. I might have tried and failed. Like I did, like my band writer series, I tried a totally different aesthetic a couple of years before. Didn't work. It was poppy. And and then I collaborated with someone who was like, I think we should make these like Flemish still lifes and do something different. And then it's like, oh wow, that now unlocks something. So, it's not always that first time around. I think you got to sit with things, you mold them, you play with them. And you always got to be curious. And I still get a thrill out of creating. Like it still gives me an adrenaline rush. And even though my wife turns her nose up at it, it's still fun. I'll send it to my phone and like might just have like a little like look and be like, I'm
Yeah.
kind of proud of myself to be able to do these things. And I'm like, yeah, no one's seen it, but I'm still pretty chuffed.
And so you should be. I love your passion and how you talk about it, and just to see you light up when you talk about that process of always creating, always molding, always playing. So often as you get older as a creative, maybe you don't do so much of that, and you get bogged down and working. But it's always important
Yeah.
to keep fresh and stay on top of things, eh?
Totally. There's a really interesting video on Prince's creative process, and I remember spoke about he had this thing called vault mentality, where he was like apparently only about 10% of his output was ever released, and there's this whole he's like was obsessed with just creating this like vault of his like life's work, and was and he had this, and it was just like he was prolific. It'd be, I'm leaving the concert, I'm going to go to the studio before I go out to pump something else out. And the other thing, here's another one. I also think that knowing when to let go of something or not being a perfectionist is the other thing. I think that certainly in my experience breeds a lot of procrastination.
Love it, love it. I've got some quick fire questions, bro.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just the first thing that comes to mind, real easy. So I'll ask you the first one here. What are the different ways have you got revenue? Like, how do you survive?
Um, Commercial work, licensing images, fine art sales. Uh, I also, after I finished bartending, I invested in some restaurants.
Love to hear that bartending's no longer in there, but it is in
Yeah,
some way. That's cool, bro.
it's in the heart. I couldn't get rid of it. I
Yeah,
couldn't buy
yeah,
a house,
love it,
but I
bro.
was able to throw some money into some restaurants.
What planning do you do, and who helps you to stay on track? You mentioned before about lists and checking them off, but what planning do you do, and how do you stay on task?
I mean, it's a mess. But it's me. I've got like some really appalling like Google Docs. And I've never learned how to like connect cells or do anything like that. I just go and I just put a line through stuff when I'm like done on it, and I like seeing lines through things. Yeah, yeah. If I see lines, it means that I'm moving forward.
As a creative, have you ever experienced moments of like self doubt or imposter syndrome, thinking, "What the hell am I doing here? I shouldn't be here."
Oh, all the time, all the time. I mean, it. I mean, like it took me a while to realize it. I think that I mean I have that, and it's totally natural, and that people like look to me when people look to me for like answers, especially on commercial shoots. Um, I'm like, all right, I've just gotta bluff. If I'm not 100%, And again, it's like let's not procrastinate. Let's not spend an hour trying to figure out if a shadow density is right. Let's just move on. If it doesn't feel right, let's just like shake up the composition.
How have you juggled your pursuit to create, and how do you make it financially viable? So, I guess was talking about before about you want to be creative, you've got these personal projects, but you've also got to balance that with making sure that you're sustainable and you're making ends meet.
Yeah, I mean, I just try not to put all my eggs in one basket. I mean, and as a freelancer, I mean, just trying to have as many clients, and you know what? And there are clients like restaurant clients or people who are like early clients of mine who don't get grandfathered in at old rates that are much smaller than what I have now. There's a real like sometimes I'm like, I think I'm gonna pass them off, move on. But you know what? When times are tough and things are quiet, like they're the ones that keep the lights on and do it there. So, I just try to keep as many, as much going as possible.
Love it, bro. Love it. What advice would you give to other aspiring artists who are just starting their creative path?
I mean, look, the other thing, be nice. No one wants to be associated work by anything with anyone who's got like attitude. It's like maybe when you're super famous, you can add that to your little like thing like mystique. But on the way there, that's not going to work for you. And the other thing which we haven't even mentioned, I think collaboration is really important. I love working with other people. I think that it just we both add something and we get to a place and neither of us would have got to by ourselves. And I think that's great. And when you collaborate with people, like I always call it a collaboration. I don't try and be like, I'm the photographer, that's the stylist, this is this person, because I know the photographer is always going to get top billing. I'm just like, it's a collaboration. And everyone can feel great about it. And yeah, and I love that. And that's part of keeping fresh as well. Other people inspire me.
Love it. Collaboration. Be nice. It's so good. Lastly, what are some of your aha moments, bro? Like when you realize you're grinding away, think back that 6 months you had, or when you were
Mhm.
bartending, what was one of those moments where the light bulb went off and you're like, you know what? All this hard work, all these mocktails and cocktail making has paid off.
I'm still waiting for it to pay off and the big one, but I mean, in small ways. I mean, honestly, I think coming back to that, like, be nice is when someone who you get a call and someone's like, I was an assistant to like there's like one of my biggest clients now, who's this juggernaut. It's this girl Jessica Walsh, and she was an assistant to a designer on a photo shoot I did years ago. Several years later, she got really high in a company, and she reached out and she was like, I really enjoyed working with you, and you was one of the few people I worked with who gave me the time of day when I was a junior. And she came and repaid that. And it's when things like that happen, and you're like, okay, these are actually like, it's like meaningful stuff. That's the kind of stuff that gives me like, tingles. It's like when, by being a good person, like, comes around. It's not calculated. It's none of that. It's just, I'm like, yeah, wow, the world, it's almost karmic.
Bro, I thank you so much for your time, Henry. I love your enthusiasm, bro, your passion, your advice being nice, and to hear it from you, someone who's living proof of doing that and being successful and being in your element, and hearing about your passion for your creativeness and your photography and your art is awesome, and it's infectious. And I thank you so much for your time, bro, and the big idea. Really
Yes,
appreciate it, Henry. Thank you so much.
thanks, man. Appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who listened. And yeah, and also anyone who's listening here, welcome to come over and hit me up for a coffee when you're in New York for a studio visit.
Or a cocktail.
Exactly, exactly. We'll see what time of the day it is and if the kids are, needed to be put down, but one way or the other. Anyway, I appreciate you all.